system that we live in today actually has its origins in the Peace of Westphalia, which was a treaty ending the 30 Years' War in Europe in the year 1648. You might say, hey, what's the deal with something that long ago being influential today? But the fact of the matter is that that ushered in this current international system, which is characterized by sovereignty, a characteristic known as sovereignty. Sovereignty means that no state in the system recognizes any higher legal authority than itself. No state in the system, which is like the United States as a state, United Kingdom as a state, none of them recognize any higher legal authority than themselves. Another part, and the reason why they can do this is an era of territorial states. So each state that is recognized has its own territory, and within that territory, within the U.S. territory, for example, the U.S. government reigns supreme. It makes the laws, it regulates things, and people that come into the United States, regardless of their nationality, have to abide by U.S. law or be subject to that law. Now, this has profound implications for international relations and for the international system. It means there's no boss. That's really what it means. Sometimes Americans tend to think that the United States, as the most powerful country, must therefore be the boss of the system and get to make the rules. This is not true. Certainly, the most powerful country, which arguably right now is the United States, does have the largest influence and can be heavily influential in making the rules. But you set one step into Mexico, you set one step into Canada from the United States, and you are now under the control of the Mexican or Canadian government and laws. This means that Canada really, at the end of the day, does not have to do what the United States tells them to do. And the United States usually will not tell another state what to do unless we're in a situation of dire consequences where we feel that our national security is at stake. So the technical word used for this system in which sovereignty is the guiding principle is anarchy, anarchic. A lot of people think anarchic means chaotic or unorganized, but that isn't really what it means at all. Anarchy means that there are a sequence of equal parties who don't recognize any higher authority, namely the 200-odd states in the world. So most of you are used to hierarchies, which in many ways is the opposite of anarchy. A hierarchy is like the university. There's a president. Everybody knows who the president is. There are vice presidents that work for the president, and so on and so forth, down to the professors, down to the students. You always know who your boss is. And it makes sense that there'd be rules, and that you would follow the rules by and large, and that the boss would make the rules. In an anarchic system, you have to agree on the rules. There are rules, that's my first point, but you have to agree on the rules. And that is usually done by treaties. And in the current era, the United Nations, for example, is a very predominant international organization which virtually every country is a member. And if every country agrees to something, it arguably becomes a norm, which means a generally accepted principle, and that becomes one of the rules of the system. But it's not a question of the United States or Russia or China telling all the other countries what to do, once again, because it's anarchic, right? But anarchic systems do have rules. If you're talking about conflict resolution, in which, let's say, two countries are at war, or a group of rebels within a country are warring against the government, if the system is sovereign, what gives a third party, like the United States, or like the UN, or like France, any legal justification for becoming involved in that country's affairs? In other words, maybe intervening militarily to halt combat, or offering mediation services, or invoking economic sanctions. And it's a really good question, and it's a question that the international system had to deal with in the early 1990s and into the 2000s, fairly recently. The answer is that after much thought, it all comes down to human rights. And the opinion of the international community, as expressed through the opinion of the states within the United Nations, is that states have a duty to uphold the human rights of their people. Now, as we know, human rights are very often disregarded by states, or even states actively abuse the human rights of certain minorities in their countries. On the other hand, they're sovereign, so their laws are supposed to be supreme within their territory. So, the responsibility to protect is the way that the new principle is briefly expressed, or even R2P. And it means that if a country fails to uphold the human rights of its citizens, or perhaps, they could fail to do it because they are unable to, because the government is weak, or they could fail to do it because they are actively abusing certain citizens in their country. If that occurs, then the international community, the other states, have not just the ability, but they have the duty to intervene to uphold human rights, which basically everyone has agreed to through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So remember, sovereignty. No state recognizes any higher legal authority than itself, and the way that conflict resolution can continue despite the rule of sovereignty is that the responsibility to protect basically allows intervention when a given government is abusing its people.